Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Jennings. I'm a senior technical assistance provider with the Cloudburst Group, and we are here to talk about substantial amendments to HOME-ARP allocation plans. Go on to the next slide, please. So today we want to welcome you, whether in good afternoon or morning, depending upon where you are joining from. And thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Whether you are new to your role or have been part of a participating jurisdiction for a while, we hope today's presentation will be both helpful and informative. Today's webinar will include an overview of what a substantial amendment is and what circumstances trigger a substantial amendment under the HOME-ARP program. We'll cover the public participation requirements as well as best practices for submitting substantial amendments. We'll then discuss which preferences, limitations, and methods of prioritization trigger substantial amendments. Finally, we'll have the opportunity to talk as a group, and because of the size of our group, we're not going to do breakout groups. We're just going to have one large discussion where you can ask your questions about the materials covered today or other questions you might have. We will be recording the first half of the webinar, and we'll post the video and slides on HUD Exchange in the event that you need to reference it again in the future or want to share the information with your colleagues who could not join. Let's go on to the next slide. So I already introduced myself. I'm with the Cloudburst Group. I've been working with the HOME program since 2005 and have been working on HOME-ARP for the past couple of years with states and local jurisdictions. And my co-presenter today is Colleen Moore from APT Associates. Colleen, would you like to say hello?
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. My name is Colleen Moore. As Stephanie said, I'm with APT Associates and have been working with the HOME program for a long time. And then, as with all of you, have been learning about the HOME-ARP program for the last couple of years. So looking forward to discussing this with you today.
And we also have other colleagues that are watching the chat and answering questions. So please know that we have several experts in the room to support you as you all are doing your HOME-ARP work and substantial amendments. So let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to start with a poll. And what is your biggest concern about submitting a substantial amendment? And we recognize that more than one of these options may apply, so you can actually respond to more than one. First is, I'm new, I've never completed a substantial amendment before. Option B, I'm not sure what situations require a substantial amendment. Option C, I'm not clear on what the public participation requirements are. Option D, I don't have time to complete the substantial amendment. Or option E, I have no concerns. Please go ahead and respond. We see the responses trickling in. Just wait. About half of you have responded so far. All right. Can we show the poll results? Can everyone see the poll results? Okay. So it looks like about 20 people said I'm new and I've never completed a substantial amendment before. So, about the same number said they're not certain what situations require a substantial amendment. Fewer numbers, 7 said I'm not clear on what the public participation requirements are. And then 2 said they don't have time to submit a substantial amendment. No one said that they had no concerns. So you guys are in the right place. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so we're gonna go over the basics of what a substantial amendment is. Let's go to the next slide. So first of all, substantial amendments are nothing to be nervous about. It's expected that PJs will need to amend their plans. Substantial amendments provide you with the flexibility and the ability to make changes based on what is needed in your community. In today's webinar, we will review when a substantial amendment to the HOME-ARP allocation plan is required, the public participation requirements, and we'll also review examples of when a PJ may need to add or change preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization, which trigger the need to complete a substantial amendment. Let's go on to the next slide. So there are two types of substantial amendment, or two types of amendments. There's a substantial amendment and then just an amendment. The HOME-ARP notices identify specific instances when a substantial amendment is needed. For example, if a PJ wants to carry out an activity not previously described in the allocation plan, or wants to add a new preference or method of prioritization. It's important to note that PJs are not required to amend their existing citizen participation plans or CPPs to incorporate HOME-ARP requirements pertaining to substantial amendments in public participation. Instead, CPD Notice 2110-10 defines the instances that require a substantial amendment of the allocation plan. An amendment is any change that does not meet the threshold of a substantial amendment. For example, if you change your subrecipient or contractor, that does not trigger the need for a substantial amendment, even though you may need to make other changes in IDIS. Let's go on to the next slide. So let's discuss the situations in which a substantial amendment to the HOME-ARP allocation plan would be required. First, if a PJ changes the method of distributing funds, including changes here's an example. For example, the original plan states that a rolling non-competitive application would be used to solicit applications and distribute funds. However, the PJ has learned that the interest is greater than expected and is now going to use a competitive request for applications to select projects. Another change that would trigger a substantial amendment is to carry out an activity not previously described in the original allocation plan. For example, if the original allocation plan included tenant-based rental assistance and no rental housing development funds, and the PJ subsequently determines that members of qualifying populations are unable to fully utilize rental assistance due to a lack of affordable housing, and decide to shift some HOME-ARP funds to rental housing development, this would trigger the need for a substantial amendment. The next type of change that would trigger a substantial amendment is if you change the purpose, scope, location, or beneficiaries of an activity. For example, if a PJ had originally planned to provide supportive services community-wide, but then determined that they need to limit these services to a particular area in the community due to responses to an RFP from organizations that operate in a specific area. That would be a change to the location of an activity. Another instance that would require a substantial amendment is to add new preferences or methods of prioritization not previously described in the plan. The plan must identify any preferences being established for eligible activities or projects. If the original allocation plan did not identify any preferences, but later the PJ recognizes that preferences are needed to implement one or more HOME-ARP activities, a substantial amendment would be needed. We'll talk more about this later in the presentation. If the proposed change triggers a substantial amendment under your PJ's citizen participation plan, then that would also require you to submit a substantial amendment. And so an example of this maybe if the CPP indicates that when a proposed activity is canceled and there is no new activity to replace it, a substantial amendment would be required. Another example is if your CPP indicates an amount or percentage of reallocated funds are moved to one activity to another, that requires a substantial amendment. In both of these cases, the PJ or insular area must engage in a process for a substantial amendment as indicated in section V period C period 6 period of the HOME-ARP notice. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so there are some additional requirements that apply only to insular areas. In case you're not familiar with this term, insular areas include the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And so I don't know if we have anybody from those areas on the call today, but briefly, a change in these guidelines that apply to HOME-ARP funds, if it affects the form of investment, minority and women business outreach program, or refinancing, that would trigger a substantial amendment. If there is a change in the tenure type of the project or activities, or if a funding increase to a project or activity of $100,000 is $100,000 or 50%, whichever is greater. We do have specific citations related to these and can certainly follow up and answer specific questions. I would also just note that if the insular area is notified by the HUD field office that a substantial amendment does not permit a determination that the plan complies with the requirements in the HOME-ARP notice, the insular area will have a reasonable period of time to submit necessary supporting information to revise its proposed projects or activities in the HOME-ARP allocation plan. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, we're moving on to public participation requirements. As mentioned earlier, PJs must follow their citizen participation plan to determine what changes in the plan or actual activities constitute a substantial amendment. In addition, PJs must follow their citizen participation plan with respect to making substantial amendments available for public review and comment. Again, PJs are not required to amend their existing citizen participation plan to incorporate HOME-ARP requirements pertaining to substantial amendments and public participation. Instead, you need to refer to CPD Notice 2110 that defines the instances that require a substantial amendment of the allocation plan. PJs must follow the adopted requirements for reasonable notice for plan amendments as described in their current citizen participation plan. And PJs must make the proposed substantial amendment available for a 15-day public comment period. If the PJ citizen participation plan requires a public hearing prior to submission of a substantial amendment, the PJ must comply with that requirement. However, a public hearing is not required unless that requirement is included in your citizen participation plan. The 15-day written comment period is required regardless of the PJ's citizen participation plan requirements. PJs must follow all applicable fair housing and civil rights requirements and procedures for effective communication, accessibility, and reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities, and provide meaningful access to participation by residents with limited English proficiency. PJs must also ensure that the public notice include a link to obtain more information on the details of the substantial amendment, where the public can access the draft substantial amendment, dates of the public comment period and public hearing if required, instructions to submit comments, and procedures to request translation services and accommodations. PJs should consider any comments or views of residents of the community, if any, in preparing the substantial amendment. A summary of these comments or views and a summary of any comments or views not accepted and the reasons why should be attached to the substantial amendment. Let's go on to the next slide. So let's talk about some key considerations PJs are encouraged to follow when completing a substantial amendment. First, be sure to provide an adequate justification for the need for the change. For example, if you're going to add a preference that was not previously included, be sure the plan describes the unmet need or gap in service that will be addressed in establishing the preference. Second, make sure all the changes to the plan are clear and easy to identify. This will help the public and HUD staff during their review process. You can do this in a number of ways, such as using track changes in the document or drafting a summary of all changes to add to the beginning of the complete plan. Lastly, continue to use strategies to broaden and increase public participation. This can include using a variety of media platforms such as social media, website, and radio ads. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual process of submitting a substantial amendment in IDIS. To submit the substantial amendment for HUD review, PJs must follow the process in IDIS to make an amendment to your fiscal year 2021 annual action plan. This is similar to the process for submitting the original HOME-ARP allocation plan. For further details on how to complete this in IDIS, you can watch the webinar entitled How to Submit a HOME-ARP Allocation Plan to HUD, which is available on HUD Exchange. A link for this webinar is on the resource page of this presentation, which you'll see later on in the presentation. PJs are not required to make any other edits to the FY 2021 Annual Action Plan or applicable consolidated plan screens in the Econ Planning Suite. Next slide. So once the FY 2021 Annual Action Plan is reopened, a PJ must upload a Microsoft Word or PDF version of the plan as an attachment next to the HOME-ARP allocation plan option on the AD-26 screen. This is for PJs whose fiscal year 2021 annual action plan is a year 2, 3, 4, or 5 annual action plan, or on the AD-25 screen for PJs whose FY 2021 annual action plan is a year 1 annual action plan that is part of a 2021 consolidated plan. So please note the upload space may be limited in IDIS. PJs need to ensure that the substantial amendment is included within the context of the full plan or attached to the approved plan. You can do this either by using track changes in the approved plan, adding a summary page to the approved plan, or attaching the amendment with the original approved allocation plan. On the AD-26 screen or AD-25 screen, add a note under the box purpose of the amendment, indicating that the substantial amendment is for the HOME-ARP allocation plan. All right, next slide. So I'm now going to turn it over to Colleen Moore to talk about preferences, limitations, and methods of prioritization.
Thanks, Stephanie. So we're going to briefly begin by summarizing the definitions of preferences, limitations, and methods of prioritization. It seems likely that this may be a source that triggers a number of different kinds of substantial amendments. Next slide, please. So just to run through these quickly, a preference permits an eligible member of a QP, qualifying population, to be selected for assistance before another eligible qualifying applicant. So for example, a rental project adopts a preference for chronically homeless households. A limitation actually excludes certain QPs, qualifying populations, or subpopulations of QPs from eligibility for a project or activity. So for example, a non-congregate shelter project is going to limit admission to individuals and families that qualify under the domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking qualifying population, which is QP3. A method of prioritization is the process used to determine how two or more eligible QP applicants qualifying for preferences are actually selected for HOME-ARP assistance, or, for example, to reside in a HOME-ARP funded project. So for example, a rental project adopts a preference for chronically homeless households. Chronically homeless applicants are selected based on the length of time they've been homeless. So that is the actual method of prioritization among those eligible applicants. Next slide, please. So before we start actually reviewing examples, we want to remind you that substantial amendments must include the same information that was required during your first submission of the allocation plan. And again, I just want to reiterate what Stephanie said, I think at the beginning, that, it is expected that many PJs, if not most PJs, may need to submit a substantial amendment at some point. But just keep these things in mind as you're doing that, okay? PJs must consider and include specific details about the intention to give preference to a QP or a subpopulation. Again, here we're really referring to those substantial amendments that are triggered by preferences or limitations. So you have to give specific details about that intention to give preference to a QP or a subpopulation within a QP, or to establish or change a method of prioritization. You have to explain how the use of a preference or a method of prioritization will actually address an unmet need or a gap in benefits identified in the plan, and identify how the PJ will address needs of qualifying populations that are not included in the preference. So again, they're just in line with the intent of your allocation plan overall, right? Which is to look at the needs and address gaps that you identify in your community. Here, you need to show how your change, the amendment that you're submitting, is going to help you address those as well. And again, how you will address the needs of QPs not included in the preference, since you must address the needs of all QPs overall in your HOME-ARP program. You must also ensure that the preferences, limitation, or method of prioritization does not violate any and all applicable fair housing, civil rights, and non-discrimination requirements. And that's also very important. Next slide, please. So as you begin implementing your HOME-ARP projects and activities, there are several circumstances which may cause you to change or add preferences or limitations, thereby triggering a substantial amendment. You may determine, for example, that you need to add or change your preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization as you begin to understand how projects are actually going to operate, such as during the project selection process. You may identify projects that target assistance to specific qualifying populations. It may also come up as proposed projects seek additional funding sources that they're going to layer with HOME-ARP funding. Excuse me. It could also happen during the implementation of your referral methods. For example, if a PJ wants to adopt a referral method that has an inherent preference, such as expanded coordinated entry. You may also see the need to change or add preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization due to another situation that requires a substantial amendment, such as adding new activities that were not previously described in your allocation plan. Okay, now we're going to talk through a few examples of why you would need to make a substantial amendment related to these kinds of situations. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay, so here's our first example. It has to do with a fictitious community that we've called Loveton Consortium. Loveton's HOME-ARP allocation plan was accepted, and they're now ready to begin implementing their program. During the HOME-ARP allocation planning process, Loveton Consortium decided not to establish any preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization. Their consultation, public participation, and needs assessment and gaps analysis clearly indicated a need for affordable rental housing for all 4 QPs. So, you know, it did not appear that those preferences or limitations were needed at the time. They then issued an RFP for the HOME-ARP rental housing activity. During the review of those proposed projects that came in response to the RFP, Loveton noticed that several of the projects that they'd like to consider funding actually targeted HOME-ARP rental units to households experiencing homelessness. So that would be QP1. Next slide, please. So in this example, the PJ did not initially establish a preference or limitation in their allocation plan. All of the proposed projects that were received in response to their RFP actually targeted a specific QP or a subpopulation of a QP. And the PJ would like to fund one or more of those proposed projects, but realizes that in order to do so, they need to do a substantial amendment. The PJ reviews their approved allocation plan to ensure that the consultation and needs assessment clearly identifies an unmet need or gap and provides adequate justification for the preference. The PJ then ensures that the preferences aren't violating any fair housing or civil rights laws, and they can do that by contacting their local fair housing, FHEO office. That's the HUD office, and they can do that typically through their local field office. And they should do that before drafting a substantial amendment to ensure that they will not be running afoul of any of those requirements. Now, we do think that it will probably not be an uncommon situation that PJs initially did not plan any preferences, but later find that they have a need to establish a preference or limitation based on what they receive in response to an RFP. If the PJ did not establish a preference or limitation in their plan, and they want to move forward with awarding a project that targets a specific QP, then they would be required to amend the allocation plan, and they need to do that prior to executing a written agreement that's related to that project or projects. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a bit of a different example, another community that we've created called Shakerstown. Shakerstown issued an RFP for a HOME-ARP NCS or non-congregate shelter project and received a proposal from a reputable developer. Before awarding the funds, Shakerstown, the PJ, performed their due diligence assessment. During that process, the developer indicated that they plan to convert that non-congregate shelter to a COC-funded permanent housing project during the restricted use period, but after the HOME-ARP minimum use period. The developer will be applying for COC program funds for rental assistance to the project. Shakerstown realizes that their approved allocation plan does not currently establish a limitation for a subpopulation of QP. That's the qualifying population of persons experiencing homelessness. They don't currently have that limitation for chronically homeless households. Next slide, please. So, this is a situation where multiple funding sources require or trigger a need for a substantial amendment. Another instance of why a PJ would need to change or add a preference or limitation during the project selection process includes this very thing: when a proposed project includes multiple funding sources with eligibility conditions. In this example, the PJ issued an RFP for non-congregate shelter, or NCS. But before committing HOME-ARP funds, the PJ discusses with the owner if they intend to continue operating the project as emergency shelter, NCS, under, for example, the ESG program, or they intend to convert it to permanent housing. The owner intends to convert the NCS to permanent supportive housing funded through the COC program and will apply for COC funding. Under the COC program, there are additional eligibility conditions that apply when COC funds are used to provide rental assistance. So COC program funds for permanent supportive housing are required to serve chronically homeless individuals as defined under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So given all that and the requirements of this additional or multiple funding sources, the PJ determines that it needs to submit a substantial amendment to include a limitation for a subpopulation of QP1. That would be the chronically homeless subpopulation. The PJ must ensure that there's adequate justification in their plan to support the need for the limitation and ensures that the preference does not violate any fair housing or civil rights laws before drafting the substantial amendment, and certainly before submitting the substantial amendment. While this doesn't need to be completed right away, a substantial amendment would be required before the conversion takes place. The PJ must also include the definition of the subpopulation. It's important to remember that preferences and limitations do not make populations eligible who would otherwise be ineligible. So all subpopulations must be related to the HOME-ARP QP or qualifying population definition. For projects or activities that will utilize these multiple funding sources, the PJ must review and determine if their established preferences or limitations align with the required eligible populations of another funding source, in this case, the COC or Continuum of Care program. In some circumstances, the PJ may need to substantially amend the allocation plan. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, another sort of different type of example. This one called, we've labeled this community Ocean Park. During the HOME-ARP allocation planning process, Ocean Park began discussions with the local COC, or Continuum of Care, about using expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral source for HOME-ARP activities. This is something that, we're sure many PJs have considered or have held discussions about. At that time, in this example, the CFC stated that they did not have the capacity to expand their coordinated entry to include all 4 QPs, all 4 qualifying populations under HOME-ARP. They would not all typically be included under the regular coordinated entry requirements, and so a COC would need to expand that in order to include them. Ocean Park described the use of coordinated entry and other referral sources in their approved allocation plan and established no preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization. So that means that the coordinated entry in this case can only be used for intake and eligibility review, not as the sole referral source. Following approval of the plan, the PJ and the COC worked together to expand the coordinated entry to include all 4 QPs. They also agreed on an appropriate method of prioritization. Next slide, please. So substantial amendments are also required when the method or methods of prioritization are added or changed from the original allocation plan. In this example, in the currently approved allocation plan, the PJ describes using standard coordinated entry with other referral methods and established no preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization. During these ongoing discussions with the COC, it was determined that coordinated entry could in fact be expanded to include all 4 QPs that must be served under the HOME-ARP program. The PJ confirms all the necessary conditions are met before moving forward with changing the referral method to HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. Because the PJ will now use expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral source, the PJ must determine if the coordinated entry's existing method of prioritization aligns with the PJ's established needs and complies with HOME-ARP requirements, or establish the method of prioritization to be used for HOME-ARP and include this information in their allocation plan. This change definitely requires the PJ to submit a substantial amendment. As PJs begin to think about the use of referrals for specific projects, they may find the need to make substantial amendments to their allocation plan. Next slide, please. So one more example, this one called San Vista Valley. You can see here, San Vista Valley decided it would like to include a new activity that was not previously described in their approved allocation plan. San Vista Valley wants to add a homelessness prevention HOME-ARP supportive services activity for QP2. Those are those at risk of homelessness. So the PJ in this case understands that since they're actually adding a new activity that wasn't described in the allocation plan, they must submit a substantial amendment. In addition, because the activity will give a preference for QP2, those at risk of homelessness, they must also include this added preference in the substantial amendment. Next slide, please. So in this example, the PJ would need to submit a substantial amendment because they're adding an activity not previously described in their allocation plan, and they also need to add a preference in order to implement that activity. PJs may find the need to add or amend their preferences or limitations when a project or activity type is added that was not previously described in the plan. I think that's one that probably is going to be quite quite obvious, right? If you, as a PJ, if you determine that you need to add an activity in order to address needs or gaps in your community, that will certainly trigger the need for a substantial amendment. In that case, in that event, the PJ must also ensure that preferences that are described there also align with that newly proposed activity. Okay, so that was a lot of information. In the next slide, we're going to, I was going to say, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond to a poll here. So based on what you've heard thus far today, do you think you will need to submit a substantial amendment? There's yes, no, C is maybe, I'd like to talk through a specific situation, and D is I'm avoiding the need to submit substantial amendments. And we'll give you, you know, a little bit of time here to think about that and respond. More than half of you have responded at this point, and it looks like slightly, I would say that it looks like about a little over 20% think they're pretty likely to have to submit a substantial amendment. Just about 20% say no, they will not have to submit a substantial amendment. Not quite 10%, maybe. And a little bit less than that are avoiding the need to submit substantial amendments. And actually, I mean, that is another, you know, potential takeaway from this presentation today is if you can see some of the situations that will trigger a substantial amendment, and if you do want to avoid that for some reason, you know, you may want to avoid those situations. Again, it is. We do not think it'll be unusual that PJs will need to submit substantial amendments, and it's really not anything to be afraid of. I mean, it's certainly people do it with their in their action plans often, or their consolidated plans. And here it really does not need to be that complicated if in fact it's in service of meeting the needs in your community. Next slide, please. So we have a few resources here. Again, the first one always is the HOME-ARP notice. That's notice CPD 21-10, and I think Stephanie referred to that earlier. There's also the appendix, which has a lot of very helpful information. And then the second notice, CPD 22-13, that had some revisions to the allocation plan requirements. You might remember that was what established the deadline for submission of the allocation plan. Also has some other very helpful information in that notice. And then the IDIS tutorial that Stephanie referred to earlier. And then there's also some additional material here on preferences, limitations, referral methods, both a policy brief and then another handout on those. I'm going to go to, I think we have two more short polls, and then we'll go to questions. And I'm going to ask for help from the rest of our team on those questions. But let's take a look at these polls while you're kind of thinking about that, or maybe deciding to frame your questions. So this first one is about future topics. You know, we are the TA provider team and the Office of Affordable Housing Programs are working together on providing information that's going to be most useful to you. So we want to get some additional insight into what HOME-ARP topics you're most interested in learning more about. So here you can select all that apply: underwriting, monitoring, coordinating with other PJs, coordinating with COCs, outreach, compliance through the required period there, preferences and limitations. We talked about a little bit here, but there's certainly more to discuss. And then creating supportive housing, due diligence, financial assistance, best practices, TBRA, or other. And I guess I don't see the actual poll page here, but I guess you have an opportunity to write in other if you want. And we'll give you a little bit to select those topics. Okay, well, while you're still giving that some thought, I'm just going to mention it looks like underwriting and monitoring are the two most popular at this point. I don't know if that's because they're the first two on the list, but there are also several folks that have indicated coordinating with COCs, preferences and limitations, maybe not quite as many as I would have anticipated. So maybe we've been able to provide some additional information here today. And let's see, we also have insurance compliance. Yeah, I think those are the top ones, and maybe a few people are interested in financial assistance. I think these are some examples of some of the topics that I think we have been considering for additional either products that we can make available on HUD Exchange or programs. And so speaking of that, let's go to the next poll. I think this one is a poll. This is about kind of future trainings and what modality or what method of delivery you would like to see more of. And again, here you can select all that apply. So it's either webinars with Q&A, kind of like what we're doing today. We've done some virtual one-on-one meetings. We certainly did some of those in the period just preceding the deadline for submission of the allocation plans. Virtual office hours. We're also thinking about in-person programs, either half-day workshops, full-day workshops, or multi-day workshops that might deal with different topics. And then certainly handouts and written materials, some of which have already been produced and others that are in process. And then the other thing is sort of templates that can be used in your program implementation. And then also pre-recorded training videos. I think we do have some of those already available on HUD Exchange. Okay, great. Well, we're having some responses come in. It looks like both handouts and webinars with Q&A like this one are kind of neck and neck right now, with templates and pre-recorded training videos following close behind. I think probably about half of you still kind of thinking about what's your preference on that. But in any case, we really do want to appreciate that input from you, because it's much better, obviously, to provide information for people in the way that they're most able to and prefer to consume it. So we really appreciate your input. I think now we can get to some questions. I know I have some colleagues who've been monitoring the chat and the Q&A box, and
Colleen, we don't have any questions in the chat, but certainly we can open it up if people want to come turn their camera on and ask a question. We welcome that as well.
Sure. And I would just say in the Q&A box, you can feel free to type in a question if you, and it may be possible that it can just be, if one of our team can just answer that question in the Q&A box without, necessarily coming off mute or, we have a hand raised, Sean. Not sure how to deal with that.
Okay, Jan, you should be able to unmute now.
Great. My question is, if we propose to decrease the amount of the HOME-ARP award that we had allocated to administrative, and instead use some of the administrative budget to increase the funding for the original HOME-ARP activity, would that constitute a substantial amendment to put less money in admin and more money in the approved activity?
That's a good and I think unexpected question, Jan. So you would be putting it into an activity that that was already in your plan. Not a new
Correct.
activity.
Just we need less budget for admin than we expected.
So just going back to slide number 8. So it says if you're carrying out an activity not previously described in the plan, you would need to do a substantial amendment. And then, so if it's something that you've already described, you would need to look at your citizen participation plan, which sometimes can have some triggers related to the amounts of money that you're shifting to different activities. But I am not seeing anything in the triggers identified here that would apply to the case you're describing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Jen, you probably would be looking at what would trigger a substantial amendment for you in terms of amounts, shifting amounts of money that would trigger a substantial amendment even in your regular con plan and annual action plan.
Yeah,
Great,
so
thank
look
you.
specifically in your citizen participation plan that should describe when in the event that you're doing a substantial amendment, what are the amounts or other triggers that might be there. Okay.
Great, thanks. Is anyone else thinking about any of the, as you're thinking probably in most cases in the future about implementation? I don't think very many PJs have been able to move fully into implementation at this point. Are there any situations that you're seeing that might be changing in your community, or that, for those of you in particular who said that you anticipate you may need to submit a substantial amendment? I'm curious about what are the kinds of situations you're anticipating that you think will trigger that.
Colleen, I just want to jump in and note that we had a question in the chat. How do we sign up for more TA with HUD or with HUD contracted TA? And so someone is looking for specific TA. You can request HOME-ARP TA through HUD Exchange. I don't know if we have a slide or any specific information that we could share related to that.
Sorry, hi all. I will drop the link in the chat for you all. But you would just go and request program assistance on the HUD Exchange, and I'm just pulling that link right now.
Okay, thanks, Elisa.
Yeah, I see one other comment in the chat about, thanks, Melanie. I see one other comment in the chat about change in referral method using coordinated entry system. And, one of the examples that we included in the presentation was a situation in which the COC initially said they could not expand coordinated entry, and then later said that they could. Now, I think some of you may also find the opposite situation, right? Where you thought that a COC would be able to expand coordinated entry. We're actually working with a community right now that's in this situation. And then later, after the allocation plan was submitted and approved, and the PJ was starting to move toward implementation, the COC, maybe sort of fully recognizing the implications and maybe expense of expanding their coordinated entry has kind of said, oh, no, we actually can't do that. So I think you may find that kind of in either direction, right? And it's something that could certainly cause you to need to submit a substantial amendment. And, the other thing is if there was some assumption about whether expanded coordinated entry could be made, maybe without, adequate communication and coordination with the COC, then that's something that, may come up as you move closer to implementation and, is something that will need to be addressed probably through a substantial amendment.
I'll just jump on real quickly, everyone, and just a reminder that we have open Q&A. So if you would like to also drop your name in the chat, Sean, our host, can take you off mute and you can ask your questions directly.
Yep. I think we had one hand raised, Sean.
Hi, my name's Alona Nagy. I'm from Georgia Department of Community Affairs. I have a question around, basically needing confirmation. So we did not put preferences into our allocation plan, and we recently had a request, proposal or applications for our non-congregate shelters. We got several, which was great, but because we had no preferences with regards to populations, we had several domestic violence groups apply, as well as one that is our, it's a CSB or a community service board who wants to build non-congregate shelters. So my question around changing our allocation plan is regarding so if we fund a domestic violence shelter, are we going to have to update our preferences to include DV as one of our qualifying populations for certain allocations? And then 2, for the mental health group, they could go ahead and fill the 4 types of qualifying populations. However, the mental health piece is going to be a part of that because they're very involved in our coordinated entry system and individuals who are identified primarily as homeless and chronically homeless. So how would that look with regard to substantial changes for either of those situations?
So, Ilona, can you just on the domestic violence piece? I mean, since those experiencing survivors of domestic violence are included in QP3. So I think your question was, would you need to change something? You may need to. I mean, depending on the structure of the way the project is structured and intended to be implemented. I mean, you certainly may need to make a change, but I just want to make sure I understand your question about that.
Absolutely. No, it's just to know if we need to specify with regard to survivors of domestic violence in our qualified population since we left it open. So if we do decide to fund a group that is survivors of domestic violence, do we need to actually do a substantial amendment in order to, before we choose that particular group, if we choose that group? Or do we not have to do that since we just had, and because we're not changing, we're opening it up to everyone. But if we start funding groups that have certain populations that they're serving, are we going to have to do a substantial amendment? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I invite anybody to jump in here, but my initial thought is that if you have a project that is going to, in order to be implemented in the way that it's intended and in line with HOME-ARP requirements, that may require a preference or a limitation for those survivors of domestic violence, and you didn't have any preferences or limitations in your original allocation plan, then my initial response is that yes, you would need to submit a substantial amendment to include that as a potential preference or limitation.
Okay.
Just because there were none to
Right.
begin with, and that, which is very common, I think.
Right.
So yeah, and that would need to be done, but please, I hope my colleagues will jump in here if they have any other thoughts about that particular piece of the question.
Colleen, this is Dave, and hi, Alona.
Dave.
I think, and Alona and I used to work together in Georgia, but I think that's correct, especially because you didn't have anything in the original plan and you really are creating those now
Yeah.
through implementation. And that's kind of what you got back when you put out the RFP. So that's a very common thing, I think, where people don't expect that they're necessarily going to have any preferences or limitations that come in, but then what they get back from the RFP effectively creates that. And in those cases, you are looking substantial amendment typically. That's how I would read it, the same way.
Okay. So if there are, and then for the second option, as far as limitations go, for the Community Service Board, that would not necessarily limit the qualifying populations, but I guess limit as a whole to individuals who have situations of mental health situations and challenges. How would that be an additional limitation that we would have to include in a substantial amendment, or how would that look?
So I think that one's a little bit trickier, and Elise, I'd be interested in your take here too. I think that that's one that we might want to look at a little bit more closely, particularly in terms of how that's structured, particularly because I think you mentioned that they probably would be able to address needs of all 4 QPs.
Right.
But and I'm just trying to conceptualize how a method of prioritization might work there. And I'm not,
Well, and it
can
may
check
even
that
have
out.
fair housing issues. If we decide to fund them, we would need to be very clear on who they would need to accept into their non-congregate shelter and what that looks like for those units. And so it's not a no, it's just how do we coordinate that with them to know what how they accept individuals into their non-congregate shelter if they're approved. And so, because it is a community service board and their primary goal is to help and serve individuals who do have mental health barriers. And so,
I'll jump in here. Hi, everyone. I'm Elisa Hupp. I'm with ICF, and we're running logistics behind the scene, but I'll offer a little bit of support in response to this question as well, which is it's not, one, I would definitely recommend connecting with your FHEO office
okay.
To talk that one through, but it does sound like what you're describing is a preference. So it would be a preference for that subpopulation of all QPs. So even though you're potentially serving all QPs, if someone has a mental health disability, then they essentially get moved to the top of the list or served first at the non-congregate shelter. So that is a preference. Given the nature of the preference, I would highly recommend connecting with FHEO and just talking that one through, because I don't know enough about like their target, that organization's target population.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That helps. And we'll also reach out to get some individual TA, just to make sure if it feels like we may need some additional handholding around this. So I think that it would probably be a benefit to us just to make sure that we are following everything we need to follow. So
yeah, absolutely. And I'll quickly note just for the group as well regarding direct TA. My understanding is it can take about sometimes like 3 or 4 weeks to get direct TA requests fulfilled. But I know that HUD is kind of filtering those and watching for HOME-ARP, and so I would just kind of plan accordingly, but reach out to your HUD rep and let them know as well, and they can kind of help to usher that request through.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Lana, I was just going to add a couple of things. So there is a HOME-ARP policy brief for preferences, methods of prioritization, and limitations. And at the bottom of page 3 of that policy brief, there's actually a pretty specific paragraph on the situation you described. So I would suggest that you look at that policy brief.
Okay.
And then I think back to the situation with your DV shelter, make sure you're getting information from them on, how are they proposing to accept people or screen people or prioritize people, because that'll help you to sort of understand whether or not it's a preference, which is really that they are allowing applications from all the QPs and they're deciding to prioritize certain populations, or they're wanting to limit to a particular QP or a subpopulation of a QP. And HUD standards for limitations are generally higher. So you would want to have a really clear explanation of why it was important. And, there's definitely recognition around safety, confidentiality needs, et cetera, for DV populations. So those are the kinds of things you would want to include in your justification.
Okay. Thank you. That helps out immensely. I appreciate it.
Stephanie, there's a question in the chat about adding a new additional activity, and want to invite Alicia if she likes to talk about what activity she's thinking about adding in her community. If not, we can just straight up answer the question.
And generally, I mean, adding a new activity is going to be a substantial amendment.
Yeah.
Was that the question? So we talked about
just generally speaking, yeah, it doesn't look like they wanted to go ahead and go into more detail, but there was also another brief question about the policy brief that Stephanie just mentioned. So Elisa just dropped that in the chat. A lot of these resources are at the are on the HUD Exchange, and as well as it was at the end of the slideshow too, that there was a number of other resources that are available too, that have more information.
I would say if you have questions about preferences, limitations, and referral methods, the HOME-ARP webinar, that was a really good resource. The written documents help a great deal.
I'll take that window of opportunity, Stephanie, to also plug that this is the first of 3 substantial amendment clinics. So the content, the webinar content will be the same. We're not changing the presentation, but each clinic is set up in the same way where we have the opportunity for open Q&A. And so we do encourage you, some of you may have already signed up for multiple clinics. And so once you take this information from today back and start to implement it and think about it, if you have additional questions, you're welcome to come to future clinics on substantial amendments and kind of dig in a little bit more and pose more complex questions there. And those clinics, the registration is currently closed, but they're on the clinic page. If you, I want to say there is a way to reach out and let us know, and we're kind of tracking folks. And so if there's enough interest, we can always add to the clinic. So we could always do like a 4th substantial amendment. But if you signed up for multiple, I definitely encourage you to come back to future clinics so that you can pose those questions that you come across as you're starting to implement and taking back what you learned today. It's a little bit of a quiet group today. So I think we can take that as folks are maybe feeling confident, or at least kind of taking the information and pondering from the presentation.
Well, it was a lot to digest, so certainly you should take a lease up on that offer. If additional questions do occur to you as you kind of take that back and think about how it applies to your to the program that you've laid out in your allocation plan. So we're happy to try to dig through some of those questions with you as well. Again, you can do that by requesting TA. We've done some things that have been just really just 1 or 2 questions with a PJ, and others that are that are more detailed. So please feel free to look into that. Yes, and thanks. Manuel also dropped in the chat the HOME-ARP FAQs that are on the HUD Exchange. If you haven't looked through that, the information there, not just the FAQs, but others, you may want to dig around there a bit. Stephanie mentioned one of the other preferences, limitations, or referral methods programs that was on there, but there is quite a bit of good information. It is, there's a lot to take in, but please, let us know if you have additional questions. Okay, so with that, kind of last call for any other questions. Otherwise, we might give you back 12 minutes in your day. Elisa, anything else that you wanted to ask people or add?
No, just I will encourage folks to keep an eye out on the HUD Exchange. So we're doing substantial amendment clinics, but we're also launching some additional content and implementation clinics. So this is the first in a whole series that we're expecting to last over the course of probably the next year, which includes virtual content and in-person clinics, which we're expecting to launch starting in the spring. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate the feedback.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.